hearing me this morning? Can everyone hear me? I've never been accused of being too quiet, so if something odd happens and I am, someone stick their hand up and let me know. So I thought this morning I would take the opportunity to talk to you about physical mediumship and some experiences that I had this summer. I'm pretty interactive about my talk, so if I'm going to ask a couple of questions just to get a feel for where people have been and who people know and that kind of thing. How many of you have been to Lilydale? Hopefully every hand goes up. Ooh, okay. For those of you who haven't, you need to put it on your bucket list. So, how many of you know Dr. Neil Ruskowski in Lilydale? Okay, there's really excited hands up here. So, awesome. So what I wanted to talk to you today about some experiences that I had actually this past summer at Lilydale, just outside Lilydale, with Dr. Reverend Neil, and some really phenomenal physical mediumship experiences I had. So I had the distinct pleasure this summer participating in 4 seances. All of these seances were actually held just outside of Lilydale. They were actually held at Neil's property. And they were hosted by Reverend Dr. Neil Ruskowski. For those of you who don't know Neil, Neil is actually a licensed family physician in the state of New York, and Neil has been HIV positive for 30 years. And Neil actually credits his survival and his ability to live with the disease for the fact that he's a longtime spiritualist, for spiritual healing and things like that. So he jokes about the fact that his virus is now old enough to vote because he's had it for so long. So what I just wanted to bring that up today was to show you how powerful spiritual healing and spiritualism and working with spirit can be for someone who developed AIDS at the time of, or HIV at the time that there was no cure. You know, he's been a 30-year survivor. So just wanted to sort of reinforce that proof of the power of spiritualism and the power of spiritual healing. So I'm actually going to speak about 2 of my experiences this past summer. I could go on for hours, but I promise you I won't. But I'll speak to sort of 2 of them specifically. The first one I'm going to speak about is actually a little bit different than probably seances that a lot of you have sat with, as they were, it was a Uweepi ceremony in the Lakota tradition, so I'm going to speak about that. And then I'll speak in detail about 2 seances that I sat with Kai Mungi, a spiritist from Germany. So my first sitting involved, and this was my first time that I'd sort of really gotten to know Neil and sit with Neil, so nothing like a trial by fire. My first experience was actually with a Uweepi, with a Lakota medicine name named Warfield Moose Jr. If any of you have time or are interested in some of the Lakota traditions, he has a great website and are really interesting. The Uweepi is actually part of a trilogy of First Nations practices that include the Uweepi, the Sweat Lodge, and the Vision Quest, which are considered a trinity of rites within the Lakota tradition. And what I find so fascinating about all these traditions is they all are talking with spirit, and they're all bringing forward message. They're just doing it in their own unique and individual way. The Uweepi is actually the one specifically used for healing, connecting with spirits, finding things and solutions to problems. So a really interesting and different tradition that I wasn't used to. The medicine man, and at this one, actually Neil was asked to participate as well, is actually bound in a sacred blanket. So it would be a blanket that would have, and they bind them up with leather ties quite tightly. Neil was complaining he was too tight. And they're laid down on a special altar. In this case, he had a buffalo skin that he put in the middle of the circle, and he was tied up and laid down there. The buffalo skin allows him to connect with spirits and his guides and provide that energy in the room. And as soon as he sort of laid down and Neil laid down and they started to do it, we started to see flickering lights, so spirit lights. For any of you who have experienced seances, these flickering lights started to dance everywhere. It was absolutely phenomenal. And those flickering lights would actually come to you. So they would be on the ceiling, and then they'd be beside you. And of course, if you'd reached out to touch them, which you weren't supposed to do, they would automatically disappear. The circle in the Uweepi is very interesting. In the middle of the circle is completely sacred. You were asked not to put your hands or feet into that energy. Someone did, and I've never heard such a large slap from spirit. Someone put their hands in, it was like, boom, and they're like, okay, learned our lesson, no spirits, no hands inside of that sacred circle. The spirits are able to remove illnesses, so very much their healing tradition, and they were used traditionally to find lost people too. So if a warrior or a hunter got lost, they'd hold a Uweepi to help them find out where that particular individual was and able to go and help them. You may also know the Uweepi is the tent shaking ritual, so those of you who know the Plains Indians traditions, that's what their referral to is there. And it's absolutely famous for levitation and other unexplained phenomena. Warfield Moose Jr. always starts his seances by, or his Uweepis, by saying, I'm 310 pounds, I'm proud of it, and I'm going to levitate tonight. And I was sitting there going, thinking, there's no way. He's a big guy. I'm thinking, there's no way. I love spirit. Spirit can do everything. But to levitate him, I'll believe it when I see it. Be careful when you say that, because you're going to see it. So about an hour into the Uweepi, Warfield Moose Jr. was up, levitating, and it turned around. poor Neil, for whatever reason, I guess Spirit was using all the energy for Warfield, went up and then dropped suddenly and still complains that he has a broken nose because of it. He did break his nose, but it was a really, really powerful thing. The event lasted over 4 hours. Lots of tears for those who were participating. It's probably, I'm not a crier, 90 minutes of crying that night. It was a very, very intense healing experience. And something that every sitter had a unique experience, which is nice to see as well. There was also, I don't know if any of you have heard the shrill sound of an eagle whistle. If you ever hear it, you'll never forget it. And we were sitting in the middle of this, and all of a sudden this eagle whistle started to play. Nobody had one. Everyone was searched before we went into the UEP room, so we were all searched, including the participants and those that were there. And this eagle whistle had the most beautiful sound that I've ever heard. And to the day I'll die, I'll never forget the sound of that, sort of playing completely. Both Neil and Warfield actually heard sort of voices in their head as well. Neil was struggling with some things that I won't get into because they're pretty personal, but he actually heard Spirit in his ear telling him what the solutions to that were. Neil had also said too that he actually felt hands levitating, because I said, what does it feel like? Are you suddenly there and then you're up here? And he said no, he could actually feel hands along his body lifting him up and turning him, which was absolutely phenomenal. One of the spirits that comes forward is actually one of Warfield Booth Jr.'s spirits. And he's this playful little child. And he asked, and we all heard it, he asked for a can of pop. He said, I want a Sprite. Okay? I was like, oh no, this is not gonna be good. And he said, I want a Sprite. And he said it 3 times, I want a Sprite. So thankfully, someone had a cooler and grabbed a Sprite, and we put it in the middle of Neil's floor. And while we were sitting there, no one could reach it, we couldn't reach it, Neil or Warfield couldn't reach it. You know that very distinct sound about when you pop the tab, and you hear that sound, I thought, holy cow, Spirit just opened a can of pop. So you know, it's amazing that you have that kind of proof. And what was really interesting too is we then heard a giggle. So we heard the pop open, and there was this 20-second pause where we're all going, holy cow. And then we heard a little bit of a giggle, and you could hear like the pop rattling around. And at the end of the night, I actually had the privilege, someone said, Jen, can you go over and check the can of pop? It was half empty. There was no spills on the floor. There was no sticky spots. You know when you spill a can of pop, I've done it with my dad sitting in the back. You know, you spill it when you're a kid, you're like, okay, I'll just mop it up, and they won't ever know, but there's still that sticky spot. There was none of that. So half gone, and no sticky spot on the floor. So that was absolutely amazing. At the end of the evening too, Warfield and Neil, when we came back from our final meditation in the UEP, we're actually sitting cross-legged in the middle of the buffalo robe with the ties and the blankets folded beside them. Completely impossible. You know, I'm a big Houdini fan and I know how you can do things, but there was no way that would have been physically possible. Because when Neil came back, his hands were completely, the blood had been cut off to his hands and he could barely even move them. So there was no way that he'd be able to untie himself, let alone fold and put that stuff there. So a really phenomenal and unique experience. I know that there's a website there, and if you ever have the opportunity, please look at that. Different tradition than spiritualism, there's no doubt, but the similarities are very much there, and the communication with Spirit is really amazing and something I'll certainly never forget. I never open a can of pop anymore without thinking about Neil and his little mischievous spirit in his living room. So the second and third seances that week, I had a pretty packed week of seances that week. We're actually with a physical medium named Kai Muggy from Germany. Anyone know Kai? No one know Kai? Felix Experimental Group, he's no one? Okay. Well, that's good, at least I won't be boring you with stuff you've already heard then. So Neil brought Kai over as well. Kai is from Germany and of the Spiritist tradition. Slightly different than spiritualism, but not that much difference. The big difference with the German Spiritists is they're very much about the scientific proof of survival as well as the faith of survival. So they do a lot of very independent studying to make sure that they can prove that it's independent. Kai has had experiences with Spirit from the time he was a child. When he was 11, he's a pedagogist from a university over there. His parents wanted him this to stop, so they sent him to a hypnotist, thinking that this would help stop the voices he was hearing in his head. Well, you can all imagine what happened. It intensified his ability to communicate with Spirit and gave him something to do with his schoolmates. He said sort of by 16, he hypnotized everybody in the class and had done all kinds of fun things with it, so a long tradition of that. In 2004, he began the Felix Experimental Group, and it's a consistent group of sitters that look at seance room phenomena, physical mediumship, and spirit contact, and he's just outside of Frankfurt, Germany. It's highly active and highly sophisticated and very much an experimentation group, so they do a lot of sort of the scientific side of things, and they are now just starting to focus on healing activities. Kai has been studied extensively by the scientific community. This is one thing I like about Kai, because I've still got that scientific academic background where I want to make sure that everything's legitimate. And so in 2013, he agreed to submit to a scientific investigation that was the first time since 1902 that the scientific community had studied a physical medium in a very scientific experiment. He was taken to an undisclosed location in Austria. There were no sitters in the room except for 3 scientists, a documentary filmmaker, and Julia, who's his wife and his sort of confidant. There was full control by the scientists over the seance room. It was permanently locked down. The filming and the preparation was checked by everyone. He had post and pre-checks. I won't get into the gory details, but they would literally weigh him before and afterwards to make sure that he hadn't swallowed, copious amounts of water or things like that he could bring forward as things. They did a full strip search prior to all the scientists, both himself and his wife, and with the hands in his air. So he literally, and when he was at our seance, he would do this too. He would walk into the room with his hands in the air, so there was nothing, you could see nothing in pockets, that kind of thing. And they had a total separation of him from anybody else. So once they did all that preparation, they actually then did the scientific portion of it. And he was able to do everything that I experienced in the seance. So levitation of tables, full trance channeling, the production of ectoplasm, the bringing forward of outports. He brought through a number of outports. Literally, he would say to the scientists, I'm about to bring something forward. They would shine a light in his mouth, check that there was nothing that he was able to hide anywhere. All of the scientists there were touched by outstretched hands from spirit. And they saw post-control after ectoplasm, and a number of the physicians experienced healings that they had never anticipated. So what was amazing about that, and just why I wanted to provide it for you, was that these scientists for the first time are actually providing, and they're coming out later this year, a scientific study of the fact that they can't explain it. And how amazing for spiritualism that finally these disbelievers are now saying, we don't know what to say. We don't know what to say, which is absolutely phenomenal. So a month later, so that was in July, in August, I had the distinct pleasure of working with Kai. He has a group of no more than 16. Again, it was in Dr. Neal's living room. And the traditional cabinet for Kai is actually replaced by, and this is a really great idea that I want to try and copy, is that he takes a standard hula hoop, so a large hula hoop, suspends it from the ceiling, and then puts a curtain around it. So it makes it portable and something that he can carry with him. The cabinet was just big enough for the chair and the medium to sit in the chair. The other thing he does, which was interesting, was he puts a piece of wood down in front so that the chair, spirit is able to bring him in and out of the cabinet on the chair on this piece of wood. Prior to the demonstration, a full body and cavity search was performed by a male volunteer sitter. It was actually a friend of mine, so I can assure you that it wasn't anyone that was set up to do that. And he was found to be free of any extraneous objects. And again, it was done to prove to everybody that there was nothing there that she should be hiding. What they also did too is Kai changed his clothes in front of this gentleman so that he was wearing essentially scrubs with no pockets and no way for him to hide anything, so that he wore new clothes into that place. One thing that's a little bit different about the spiritist tradition, and particularly Kai, is he uses a lengthy breathing technique called holotropic breathing. If any of you do yoga, it's much like that sort of I'm not going to do it because it's ugly sounding, but that sort of very nasal sound that we bring in through our nose to clear ourselves. So he refers to it as holotropic breathing. Many of you will know it as a yogic breathing. It took him about 6 to 8 minutes to go into that trance state. We were all sitting in circle around him during that time period. And about after 8 minutes, we heard a very gruff voice speaking in German. And you could tell this guy was a smoker. Did anyone even know Hans Bender? Big German metaphysicist, psychologist. Well, he came through, and I've actually heard Hans Bender speak on tape, and I went, oh my goodness, that's Hans coming out of that cabinet, because he's got a very distinct, raspy, smoker, coffee kind of voice. So that was my sort of the first start of thing that started of it. He spoke for German for a little bit, sort of as he got acclimatized to taking over the medium's body, and then he switched over to English. So Julia, who is Kai's wife, would say to him, Hans, English please, because the group that we're sitting with is actually speaking for English. What was really interesting too is you could tell that Hans, English wasn't his first language, because he would sort of stutter and things. He'd say sort of good evening, and then be, as he was trying to find the words. As we all know, a good medium has to have the opportunity to have a very vast knowledge of languages and experiences, because the spirit that's coming in needs to use our vocabulary and our experiences to express themselves. So it was fascinating to see someone having to speak in English as well. And honestly, at that point, my whole mind had been boggled, and he had just gotten started. So in an attempt to keep this short, because I promised I would, I'm only going to touch on the phenomena that I can recall with clarity and an indelible impression on me. Shortly after Hans Bender stopped speaking, we were all treated to a wonderful and lengthy display of spirit lights. There was this massive ball of white light that came through, and then you started to see these firefly things, and all of a sudden we heard this thumping on Neil's ceiling. And Neil's like, okay, I need to fix the ceiling, I know, not so hard up there. But it was very definite that there was something else there. I've sat with many mediums over the years, I've sat in many seances, and I've never seen anything as dramatic as this and as intense as this, which was absolutely phenomenal. I asked the medium afterwards too, because a number of times I saw that the lights would land on him. It was his way of re-energizing and then getting them back out there. So every medium sits differently, but that for him was particularly interesting. After that, Hans gave us a really interesting sort of discussion, and I have a master's in theological studies, and Hans has about 6 PhDs, and I still can't quite figure out what he was talking about, but he was trying to explain the physics of the other side and how realms work, and really, really fascinating information that I wish I could understand, and someday maybe I will. Then Hans said to Julia, who was sitting next to Kai, let's put the illuminated plaque on the floor. So probably sort of between here and you guys, he put a bit of foot by foot size plaque on the floor, and hands started to show themselves. So the plaque was there, it was very open, and because Spirit knows that hands are one thing that's very unique about human beings. Nothing in nature or nothing in animal form has a hand. So the spirit guides that he worked with like to manifest themselves with hands, with various shapes and that sort of thing. So we know specifically that it's coming from them, it's not a shadow and all that kind of thing. They had 4 different hands positions. He did a this, he did a this, he did a wave, and then he did a thumbs up. So all 4 of those were very distinctly seen. And they were 12 feet from the cabinet, so there was no way that the medium could control that, and 3 or 4 sort of 2 to 3 feet from where all of we were. Once that happened, we were treated to then a traditional display of flying trumpets. So he had 2 20-inch trumpets. These things flew. One flew by mine, and sometimes they levitate, and I'm excited when I can get mine to levitate. That's a good day for me. But these things flew. Like, they came by my ear with a whizzing noise, and I thought, holy cow, if that thing hit me, that would hurt. But these 2 trumpets were flying around the room like crazy. It was absolutely phenomenal. The trumpets, all of you know, are sort of the megaphones from olden days that were used for communication. And the other thing that was interesting was that there was intelligence behind the trumpets, because they actually made sure they didn't hit anybody. So once I sort of realized that they weren't going to hit me, I was fine with that. The next experiment, which is really unique to Kai, was actually a standard white handkerchief that had 16, I'm going to use a Kleenex just to show you all about props. It had 16 pieces of luminous tape on it. So we'd taken glow-in-the-dark tape and placed it on it. And I was actually then asked to participate in the experiment. So they asked me to put my hand into the energy circle. I was given permission to do that. And they gave me the handkerchief and to dangle it. So I'm sitting here dangling the handkerchief. Well, no word of a lie, all of a sudden Spirit came along and started doing this. Oops, they didn't rip it, thankfully. But they started tugging on the handkerchief, and I'm thinking, holy cow, something is pulling on this thing. So then I got nervous and dropped it until they all laughed. So then they asked me to pick it up again, and they asked me, Hans Bender came through and said, I want you to do a bit of a tug of war with Spirit. So it was literally, they were holding one side. If any of you have dogs and you play toys with them, they had one side, I had the other. And there was a physical tension between us and a physical pulling back and forth, which was absolutely phenomenal, was absolutely amazing. What was also amazing is that the second time that I had played sort of tug of war with him, I could actually see the hand manifesting. So I could actually see fingers across from me. Now this is all done in red light, but you could sort of see the fingers and that kind of thing manifesting. So the hand was tangible. And then what was really amazing as well is that hand, then we played a lot of music during it, and Kai, if I ever hear Hey Jude again, it'll be too soon. But Kai's favorite song and Hans Bender's favorite song is Hey Jude, so they kept playing Hey Jude over and over again. And while we're playing Hey Jude, this hand, so the handkerchief was put back down, he went back into the cabinet and sort of restarted his energy. And that hand then sat on my lap and started tapping along to Hey Jude. And I thought, no, there's not a disembodied hand tapping on my leg right now. But just to prove me there was, that disembodied hand then ran across my lap and then wandered down the other side. So if you're Munsters fans or the hand thing, it was literally like that. 5 fingers, it was cold to the touch, but it was definitely there. So finally, after 2 hours of nonstop physical mediumship, before that he turned on red light. So his last stage of it, so the first one was complete darkness, the second piece was the illumination through the handkerchief and through the board, and the last class was bright red light. This was absolutely phenomenal, something I still can't understand. So he came out of the cabinet with the red light and started to produce ectoplasm in front of us. He produced voluminous amounts of ectoplasm, because a lot of people say to me, oh, they swallow cheesecloth and they bring it back up. If he could swallow that much cheesecloth, he's my new hero, because there was volumes and volumes of ectoplasm. It came from the roof of his mouth, he opened his mouth, started to fall down into his lap and in between his feet. So by the time he was finished producing the ectoplasm, it was probably about the height of this table, about 2.5 feet tall. Then what was really interesting, he was able to manipulate the ectoplasm and open it up so we could see the interior of the ectoplasm. I don't have them here today, but I do have pictures if anyone's interested of him opening up the ectoplasm and seeing that. Then he produced a face in the ectoplasm, which the woman sitting just over to him recognized as her grandfather. And I do have that picture as well. That it's a very distinct, recognizable face, nose, eyes, chin, and all that kind of thing that she was able to recognize. That's the first time that I've actually seen ectoplasm produced, and something that I will absolutely remember till the day I die. When he finished, he went back into the cabinet, curtains were closed, and when he came forward later on, ectoplasm had completely vanished and disappeared. There was no smell. The reason I bring up smell is a lot of my friends who don't believe in the stuff said, oh, well, he brought it back forth from himself. There's a very distinct smell of something that was in one's body and comes back out of one's body. That was absolutely not the case. I've seen numerous photographs of this kind of thing. I've seen things on the internet, but I can assure you this was like walking on the Great Wall of China, and I've done it. That's probably up there with this, to actually see that produced in front of me and have it recognized. When he went back into the cabinet and we finished, when he came back, he was still in a deep trance state. It took him sort of 20 minutes to come back in. But you know, it was an absolutely amazing seance. The second night, and I won't get into a whole lot of details, but just going to sort of quickly mention that this is why I'm so convinced that he is such an amazing medium. Their tradition is slightly different in that his spirit guides ask, unlike ours where we never touch the medium in trance, that they want controls. They want volunteers from the audience to sit there next to him with his hand on, so my hand was on his knee and his thigh and his knee for 3 hours the second night, to show that he never moved. He did not move. He was in that chair the whole time. So unless he somehow got some sort of mannequin in there, well, I still had my hands on him, he did not move. So that was an absolute pleasure the second night, to be able to be sitting right next to him and see the ectoplasm being produced and see the manifestations and that kind of thing coming through. Both nights he brought through apports, which was absolutely phenomenal. And it was just an absolutely amazing evening, something I'll certainly never forget. And having the opportunity was a real privilege to sit as control, because I can tell you that he didn't move. You know, because you start to wonder the first time, is he getting up, is he wandering around, has he got a fishing pole, is there something like that going on? There was absolutely no way, because I sat with him for 2.5 hours beside him. So I just want to say these were amazing seance experiences and truly life-changing. Gave me a real sort of more appreciation for physical mediumship. And if any of you have the opportunity to sit with Kai or with Warfield Moose Jr. or Warren Kaler, absolutely phenomenal, life-changing experiences. So thank you so much for listening and allowing me to serve.
Oh, you are.